Welcome back to the Learning Designer's Playbook. You are now beginning the fourth course in this playlist, and today we're turning our attention to one of the most widely used frameworks in instructional design, Bloom's Taxonomy. In this course, we have 5 clear goals. First, we'll define Bloom's Taxonomy so you understand its origins and why it's still central to instructional design today. Second, we'll explore its 3 domains: cognitive, which focuses on knowledge and thinking; affective, which involves values and attitudes; and psychomotor, which covers physical and hands-on skills. Third, we'll learn how to apply these domains when writing objectives, ensuring that your goals guide both instruction and assessment. Fourth, we'll highlight common pitfalls, such as vague verbs like understand or know, which sound good but aren't measurable. Finally, we'll focus on replacing those weak verbs with strong, action-oriented language that reflects real learner performance. By the end of this session, you'll be able to write objectives that are specific, measurable, and directly tied to outcomes. These objectives will serve as the backbone of your training design, keeping you aligned, consistent, and accountable. Before we dive into Bloom's taxonomy, let's recap what we covered in our last session: andragogy versus pedagogy. We started by defining pedagogy as a teacher-centered model primarily used for children, where the teacher sets the pace, the objectives, and the methods. Then we contrasted this with andragogy, which Malcolm Knowles described as a learner-centered framework built around the unique needs of adults. We discussed how adult learners want autonomy and relevance in their training, and how they expect their prior experiences to be acknowledged and incorporated into the learning process. We also talked about the fact that adults are motivated differently than children. They're often driven by practical needs, professional goals, and immediate applications. Beyond that, we identified strategies that work well with adults, such as problem-based learning, case studies, and flexible pacing. At the same time, we warned against common pitfalls such as treating adults like passive recipients of information, which only leads to disengagement and frustration. The big takeaway was that pedagogy and andragogy exist on a spectrum, and your role as an instructional designer is to understand where your learners fall and adjust your approach accordingly. This knowledge sets us up perfectly for today's topic, because writing learning objectives using Bloom's taxonomy requires you to think carefully about your learners, their level of readiness, and the outcomes you expect them to achieve. Bloom's taxonomy is one of the most enduring frameworks in education and instructional design. Originally developed in 1956 by Benjamin Bloom and his colleagues, it was intended as a way to classify educational goals and make them more systematic. At its core, the taxonomy provides a structure for thinking about different types of learning, ranging from basic recall of facts to more complex tasks like evaluating evidence or creating new solutions. It was groundbreaking because it gave educators and designers a common language to describe and measure learning outcomes. In 2001, the taxonomy was revised to reflect modern understandings of learning, shifting the emphasis from nouns to verbs. For example, from knowledge to remember, from comprehension to understand, and so on. The framework is divided into 3 domains: the cognitive domain, which deals with intellectual skills; the affective domain, which focuses on feelings, values, and attitudes; and the psychomotor domain, which addresses physical skills and actions. Each of these domains recognizes that learning is not one-dimensional. Instead, it happens across thinking, feeling, and doing. For instructional designers, Bloom's taxonomy is a roadmap for writing objectives that can be taught, practiced, and assessed. When used well, it ensures that learning outcomes are not vague aspirations, but specific, measurable achievements. This clarity is why Bloom's taxonomy remains a cornerstone of both classroom and workplace learning design. Bloom's taxonomy is best understood by breaking it down into its 3 major domains. The first domain is the cognitive domain, which deals with intellectual processes such as remembering, understanding, analyzing, and creating. This is the most widely used domain, particularly in schools, universities, and corporate training. The second domain is the affective domain, which focuses on attitudes, emotions, and values. It may seem less tangible than the cognitive domain, but it's crucial for shaping learner motivation and commitment. For example, a learner may know how to perform a safety procedure cognitively, but unless they value safety emotionally, they may not actually apply the skill consistently. The third domain is the psychomotor domain, which addresses physical skills and hands-on performance. This is particularly relevant in fields such as healthcare, manufacturing, sports, and technical training. It covers everything from precision and coordination to the ability to perform tasks automatically after practice. Each domain is important in its own right, and together they provide a full picture of what it means to learn something. Instructional designers need to be aware of all three, because designing only for cognitive skills ignores the fact that learners must also develop the right attitudes and physical abilities to succeed. By appreciating the interplay between thinking, feeling, and doing, you can design more complete and effective learning experiences. The cognitive domain is the most widely used and recognized part of Bloom's taxonomy. It deals with intellectual processes and knowledge acquisition. At its foundation, the domain starts with remembering, where learners are simply recalling facts, definitions, or concepts. For example, remembering that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius is a task at this level. The next level is understanding, where learners go beyond recall to explain concepts in their own words. Here, a student might be able to describe why boiling water creates steam. The third level is applying, which involves using knowledge in new situations. A learner could demonstrate this by calculating the boiling point at different altitudes. The fourth level is analyzing, where learners break information into parts and examine relationships. In this case, they might compare how boiling relates to evaporation or condensation. The fifth level is evaluating, where learners make judgments based on evidence or criteria. For example, they might critique a method of water purification that relies on boiling. At the top is creating, where learners synthesize information to design something new. An example here could be designing a new experiment to demonstrate phase changes in water. The hierarchy moves from simple recall to complex problem solving, and this progression is intentional. As an instructional designer, you want to scaffold learning so that objectives move from basic to advanced. This ensures learners build a solid foundation before attempting higher-order tasks. A common mistake is writing objectives that jump straight to evaluate or create without ensuring learners can first remember and understand. When applied well, the cognitive domain provides a clear pathway for intellectual growth and ensures that assessment matches the intended level of complexity. The affective domain is often overlooked in instructional design, but it is just as important as the cognitive domain. This domain deals with learners' attitudes, emotions, and values. At the most basic level, learners must be receiving, willing to pay attention and listen. Without this, no real learning takes place. The next step is responding, where learners actively participate by asking questions, engaging in discussions, or showing interest. The third stage is valuing, which happens when learners begin to attach importance to what they are learning. For instance, an employee who values workplace safety will not only follow procedures but also advocate for them. The fourth stage is organizing, where learners begin to integrate new values into their existing belief systems. They might, for example, prioritize sustainability and reorganize their decision-making process around environmental impact. The final level is characterizing, which is when values become internalized and guide consistent behavior. At this stage, the learner's actions are aligned with their beliefs in a reliable and predictable way. This domain is critical because knowledge without values often fails to translate into meaningful behavior. A person may know how to recycle, but unless they value environmental responsibility, they may not consistently do it. Instructional designers should consider this domain, especially when designing training around ethics, leadership, teamwork, or cultural awareness. Activities that encourage reflection, debate, or role play can help foster affective learning. When we design objectives in this domain, we focus on shaping not just what learners know, but also how they feel and what they prioritize. In practice, this often determines whether knowledge translates into consistent real-world application. The psychomotor domain deals with physical skills, movement, and performance. And in this session, we're organizing it into 6 practical levels that align well with how people actually learn by doing. The first level is observing, where learners simply watch others perform a task. This stage is essential because attention and focus build the foundation for skill development, whether it's watching a chef prepare a dish or an athlete demonstrating proper form. The second level is modeling, where learners begin to imitate what they've seen, often under direct supervision. This is where practice begins, though it's still very dependent on guidance. The third level is standards, where learners start to measure their performance against established benchmarks, such as speed, accuracy, or form. Here they begin refining their skills based on criteria that define success. The fourth level is recognizing, which involves developing an awareness of patterns, techniques, and adjustments. Learners can now troubleshoot mistakes, identify what went wrong, and make corrections on their own. The fifth level is applying, where skills are performed independently, reliably, and in increasingly complex situations. At this stage, learners demonstrate confidence and adaptability, able to transfer their skills across different contexts. The final level is coaching, where mastery is so strong that learners can now teach, guide, and support others. Coaching is the ultimate test of psychomotor skill because explaining and demonstrating for someone else requires deep understanding and fluid execution. For instructional designers, this model highlights the importance of progression. You can't expect someone to jump directly into application without observation or modeling first. It also reminds us that performance-based assessments should track growth across these stages rather than focusing only on the final product. By designing practice opportunities at each level, you help learners gradually move from passive observers to skilled practitioners and eventually mentors. This progression is especially valuable in fields like healthcare, aviation, or technical training, where precision and hands-on expertise are non-negotiable. Now that we understand Bloom's taxonomy, let's talk about how to use it to write better learning objectives. A learning objective is a statement that describes what the learner will be able to do by the end of instruction. Unfortunately, many objectives are vague or unmeasurable. Objectives like understand teamwork or know safety rules sound reasonable but are not specific enough to assess. Instead, objectives must be written with clarity and precision. A strong objective is specific, meaning it clearly defines the expected outcome. It is measurable, meaning you can assess whether the learner has achieved it. It is action-oriented, meaning it includes a verb that describes what the learner will actually do. And it is aligned with Bloom's levels, meaning the verb and activity match the intended depth of learning. For example, instead of saying, understand teamwork, you might say, demonstrate effective teamwork by contributing at least 3 ideas during a group project. Instead of know safety rules, you might write, apply safety protocols by identifying hazards in 3 case studies. Notice how these objectives are observable and measurable. Bloom's taxonomy helps by giving you a list of verbs that correspond to different levels of learning, like define, analyze, design, or evaluate. Using these verbs ensures that your objectives can guide both instruction and assessment. Objectives are not just statements for the syllabus. They are the backbone of your design. They shape how you teach, what activities you assign, and how you evaluate success. By writing better objectives, you create a direct link between what you want learners to achieve and how you will know they achieved it. One of the most practical tools Bloom's taxonomy provides is a set of action verbs that match different levels of learning. The verbs you choose when writing objectives make a tremendous difference in clarity and assessment. Weak verbs like know, understand, or learn may sound fine, but they do not tell us how the learner will demonstrate their knowledge. For example, how would you measure if someone understands leadership? Everyone might interpret it differently. Instead, Bloom's taxonomy encourages the use of strong, specific verbs that describe observable actions. At the lower levels, verbs like list, define, or identify work well. At the mid-levels, verbs like apply, demonstrate, or analyze are effective. At the higher levels, verbs such as evaluate, design, or create push learners toward more complex tasks. For instance, instead of writing, "Students will understand leadership styles," you might write, "Students will analyze case studies to identify different leadership styles." This way, assessment becomes straightforward. You can directly observe whether learners can analyze and identify. The choice of verbs also guides instruction. If your objective uses the verb design, you'll know you need to include opportunities for learners to engage in creative tasks. If your verb is evaluate, you'll need to provide criteria and opportunities for judgment. Strong action verbs provide clarity, direction, and accountability. They ensure learners know exactly what is expected and instructors know how to measure success. As an instructional designer, mastering the use of verbs is one of the simplest yet most powerful ways to elevate your objectives. Even with Bloom's taxonomy as a guide, many instructional designers and educators fall into common traps when writing objectives. One of the biggest pitfalls is using vague or immeasurable verbs. Words like know, understand, and learn might feel intuitive, but they don't tell us how learners will demonstrate mastery. Another mistake is writing objectives that don't align with assessments. If your objective says, "Analyze a case study," but your assessment only asks for multiple choice recall, there's a mismatch that undermines the credibility of your design. Objectives that are too broad can also be problematic. For example, learn math is so wide in scope that it is essentially meaningless. On the other hand, objectives that are too narrow, such as memorize the definition of one equation, may not connect to larger learning goals. Designers also sometimes ignore the hierarchy of Bloom's levels. They may write an objective at the create level without first ensuring that learners can remember, understand, or apply foundational knowledge. Another issue is writing objectives that don't consider the learner's context. An overly complex objective for beginners can lead to frustration, while an overly simple objective for advanced learners can lead to boredom. A good objective should challenge learners without overwhelming them. It should also tie directly into how you plan to assess performance, ensuring that the learning journey has both a clear starting point and a clear endpoint. By avoiding these pitfalls, you ensure that your objectives not only guide instruction, but also set learners up for meaningful success. One of the best resources for diving deeper into Bloom's taxonomy is a taxonomy for learning, teaching, and assessing by Lauren Anderson and David Krathwohl. This book updates and expands Bloom's original framework, making it more relevant for today's educators and instructional designers. It provides a detailed explanation of each domain and level, along with practical examples of objectives and assessments. What makes this resource so valuable is that it doesn't just describe the theory, it shows you how to apply it in real instructional settings. If you want a comprehensive guide that helps you move from theory into practice, this book is a must-read. Let's pause and recap what we've covered in this lesson. We began by revisiting Bloom's taxonomy and its three domains: cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. The cognitive domain guides intellectual development and is most often used in instructional design. The affective domain addresses attitudes, values, and emotions, reminding us that learning is not just about knowledge but also about motivation and belief systems. The psychomotor domain emphasizes physical skills, practice, and coordination, which are essential in fields requiring hands-on performance. We explored how each domain has progressive stages, moving from simple to complex levels of learning. We then examined how Bloom's taxonomy helps us write better objectives by ensuring they are specific, measurable, and action-oriented. We also discussed the importance of strong action verbs and how weak verbs undermine clarity. Examples showed us how to transform vague objectives like understand teamwork into measurable ones like demonstrate teamwork by contributing to group discussions. We looked at common pitfalls, such as writing objectives that are misaligned with assessments, overly broad, or too narrow. Finally, we highlighted a valuable resource, a taxonomy for learning, teaching, and assessing that gives you practical tools to apply Bloom's framework in real-world instructional design. Together, these ideas give you a structured way to create objectives that not only clarify expectations, but also support meaningful learning. As we summarize today's lesson, it's important to see Bloom's taxonomy not just as a checklist, but as a tool for thoughtful instructional design. The hierarchical structure reminds us to build learning in steps, moving from simple recall to higher order thinking. The three domains, cognitive, affective, and psychomotor, highlight that true learning encompasses knowledge, attitudes, and skills. Strong action verbs are essential because they provide clarity and make outcomes measurable. Without them, objectives remain abstract and open to interpretation. Alignment is another key principle, ensuring that objectives, instruction, and assessments all point in the same direction. If you teach at one level but assess at another, you risk confusing learners and undermining the purpose of instruction. Another principle is balance. While it's tempting to focus only on the cognitive domain, the affective and psychomotor domains play critical roles in shaping behavior and performance. Using Bloom's framework allows us to create objectives that don't just measure what learners know, but also how they feel and what they can do. This creates a more complete picture of learning and ensures transfer into real-world practice. In addition, Bloom's taxonomy encourages us to think critically about progression. Are learners truly ready to evaluate or create, or do they first need time to practice applying and analyzing? By consistently returning to these principles, you ensure your learning objectives remain meaningful, actionable, and relevant to learners' needs. In conclusion, Bloom's taxonomy is more than just a theory. It is a practical framework that strengthens your ability to design effective learning experiences. Your next step is to practice writing your own objectives, making sure they are specific, measurable, and action-oriented. Use Bloom's verbs as a reference when drafting new objectives or refining old ones. Align your objectives with assessments to ensure consistency and fairness. Finally, explore the recommended resource to deepen your understanding and application of this powerful tool. With these steps, you'll be ready to design objectives that truly guide and transform the learning process. See you in the next lesson, how to write training objectives that actually work.